I just wanted to thank everybody for tuning in today. But I know we have at least one World War II veteran that's tuning in with us today, Mr. Arthur Grabiner. We're really honored that you're watching this today, and I will get to your question at the end of the presentation. But this subject is, I mean, it deals with a lot of what ifs. So, I mean, it's all hypothetical, but one of the alternatives to the end of the war with Japan was an amphibious invasion, and it was approved. At least one part of it was approved by President Truman. So, had the Manhattan Project failed, this would have been the course of action that the Allies took to end the war. Now, let me share my screen with you here. Okay. So this is it, Operation Olympic, an invasion that fortunately never happened. Now, the plan to end the war with Japan was called Operation Downfall, which was a two-stage plan of invasions to end the war. The first was Operation Olympic, which was scheduled to take place on November 1st, 1945. And had Olympic been successful in securing Kyushu, the southern island Japan, they would have went ahead with the invasion of Honshu on March 1st, 1946. Now, this presentation is filled with lots of numbers, so you're kind of going to get beat over the head with numbers. And I apologize for that, but I think that's the only way you can really discuss this subject. Now, most of these figures were taken from Rich Frank's excellent book on the subject, Downfall, the End of the Japanese Empire. Now, he conducted exhaustive research, and this is probably the best resource on the subject. So the situation in the spring of 1945 was that Harry Truman was sworn in as 33rd president of the United States after the death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, even though Truman was vice president, he was completely unaware of the Manhattan Project or the development of atomic weapons. That's something he learns when he's sworn in as president. 2 weeks go by before Truman is fully briefed on the weapon. Now, again, this weapon's only in development at this point, and there's not an example of this weapon. They don't even know if it's going to work. So the plan that's adopted in the summer of 1945 to end the war is the invasion of Japan, which we talked about earlier, Operation Downfall, the two-stage invasion. So this whole presentation is under the assumption that the Manhattan Project had indeed failed. So here we see a situation map of Operation Downfall. So this is a very, very large overview of the operation. So if you see Operation Olympic there, that's what we're going to talk about today. And then you see Operation Coronet, which was in the works but not approved. So here we see some of the units that would have participated in the first invasion, Operation Olympic. Most divisions, Army or Marine divisions that were already in the Pacific Theater of Operations were going to be involved. You see there the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Division would have been involved in the operation. Their last operation before this would have been Iwo Jima, so they had seen some of the most brutal fighting of the war already. Then you look at the naval units that would have been involved. You're talking over 30 aircraft carriers of all types, the big Essex-class fleet carriers to the Independence-class light carriers, and of course, escort carriers. 20 battleships, 52 cruisers, 462 destroyers and destroyer escorts, and then nearly 400 troop transports. Also, you're looking at nearly 1,000 large amphibious vessels. And of course, that excludes the amphibious vessel we're probably most familiar with, which was the, or landing craft we're familiar with, the Higgins boat. And if you look at the air power, the Air Force commitment to the operation, it's massive. So 5th Air Force, 8th Air Force was moved over from Europe and was going to be operating from Okinawa. 7th Air Force, 13th Air Force, and the 20th Air Force. So here we have a better picture of Operation Olympic here. So on the southwest coast of the island, you would have had 5th Amphibious Corps, which consisted of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions. Then in the center, you would have had the 11th Corps, consisting of 1st Cav, the Americal, and the 43rd Infantry Division. And then on the east coast of the island would have been the 1st Corps, with 25th ID, 33rd, and 41st Infantry Divisions. Then down to the south of the island, there were a lot of these smaller islands laying off the coast. Now, preliminary operations would have saw invasions there as well. So just a massive, massive undertaking here. You're talking 35 landing beaches in this operation, with 9 assault divisions. So what does that mean in terms of numbers? Well, it means 766,000 men, 134,000 vehicles, 1.5 million tons of material, and over 1,300 major amphibious vessels. Now, the plan was, once the island of Kyushu was secure, this would become a staging area for an even larger invasion that would occur in March of 1946, the invasion of Honshu, the Japanese main island. So when these plans were made, they assumed that the Japanese would be able to field no more than 10 divisions on Kyushu. Also, that the Japanese were unable to oppose the invasion fleet with no more than 2,500 aircraft. Now, this invasion plan did take into account that the Japanese civilian population was completely mobilized for the defense of the island. So on X Day, November 1st, 1945, when we would have landed there, we would have put 9 divisions ashore with the intention of facing only 3 Japanese divisions on the beaches at Kyushu. So if we take a look at Ketsu-Go, which is the Japanese plan to defend their island, we'll see that the Japanese had correctly predicted southern Kyushu as the target for an amphibious US invasion. Now, there was a deception operation that they planned to use to support Olympic, kind of similar to Fortitude was to Overlord. This was called Operation Pastel, but it's highly unlikely the Japanese would have bid on this. Pastel would have tried to deceive the Japanese into believing an invasion would occur in Korea or Formosa, but the Japanese weren't going to bite on that. Also, after Okinawa, the Japanese predicted a lull in US operations, which they correctly did. So the Japanese planners were correctly assumed that the US would strike in October, and they were really close to that. Olympic was, of course, scheduled for November 1st. Now, the Japanese plan involved 10,000 aircraft, over 10,000 aircraft to oppose the invasion fleet. Japanese were staking all their fortunes on Kyushu, and they were going to use every aircraft they had to repel that invasion. Now, of that 10,000 plus aircraft number, half of those were committed to the Kamikaze mission. So that's an enormous number of suicide attackers that were going to be committed to the battle. And it's also, I guess, interesting to note that this plan was legitimate because after the war, there was a survey conducted by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, and they discovered that the Japanese had close to 900,000 military personnel on Kyushu in August, with 9 divisions concentrated in the south to face U.S. landings. Also, it was discovered that the Japanese had stored adequate food, fuel, and 40% of all the ammunition in the home islands was stockpiled and cached on Kyushu to repel this invasion. So as I mentioned, the U.S. was aware of this buildup through signals intelligence. And this fluid situation would have undoubtedly led to some alterations of the Olympic plan. So maybe because of this buildup, the United States may have conducted a protracted bombing campaign against Kyushu, and undoubtedly would have assembled a larger invasion force. Or maybe the invasion would have been postponed. But for our purposes today, we'll just assume the U.S. went ahead with Operation Olympic on November 1st, 1945. So what would have waited for our fleet at Kyushu? Well, as I mentioned earlier, massive air opposition. The Japanese, with their 10,700 available aircraft, would have committed half that number to the suicide mission. Now, the other half of the aircraft weren't necessarily committed to conventional attacks like dive bombing and torpedo attacks, but they just weren't committed to the suicide effort yet. It's very possible the Japanese might have said, let's send all 10,700 out as suicide attackers. Now, the airfields that these suicide attackers would have been flying from, they were identified by our air forces, and they would have been heavily attacked. But the Japanese were very good at camouflaging these aircraft, and in many cases, they dispersed these aircraft as far as 5 miles away from these airfields. So the Japanese may have had a chance to get a good number of these aircraft airborne. So the plan was massive aerial suicide attacks. The Japanese planned to launch 300 to 400 per hour during daylight hours, and the Imperial Japanese Navy was expected to do the same. Of course, the Japanese Navy would have conducted most of their operations at night or pre-dawn hours or low light hours. So massive, massive suicide attacks. Now, the fleet's best defense to this kamikaze threat would have been this doctrine they developed called the Big Blue Blanket. Now, this was the brainchild of Commander Jimmy Thatch, who was already famous for developing tactics to defeat the Japanese Zero at the beginning of the war. But I guess the components of the Big Blue Blanket would have been around-the-clock fighter patrols, combat air patrols over the fleet, all 24/7. Early warning radar picket vessels that would have been stationed 50 miles outside of the fleet's main body. These ships, as they did at Okinawa, would sort of act as the canary in the coal mine, and would give the fleet an early warning for incoming Japanese suicide aircraft. Now that information would have been filtered through a combat information center, and these fighters would have been radar vectored to meet this suicide threat as they appeared. And also, there was an offensive element of this as well. So the idea was to conduct fighter sweeps over these Japanese airfields in the hopes to destroy as many of these aircraft on the ground as possible. Now, once a suicide attacker broke through the combat air patrol, a ship's best defense against the kamikazes was this weapon right here, the 5-inch dual-purpose gun. Now, this weapon fired a high explosive projectile that weighed 53 pounds, had a rate of 15 rounds per minute, and could hit targets nearly 40,000 feet away. Now, this projectile fused with the variable timed fuse, also known as a proximity fuse, was the best defense against the suicide attacker. This projectile was the only projectile large enough to deflect or disintegrate a suicide attacker. Once a suicide attacker was in his steep dive, even blowing off large areas of control surfaces, blowing wings off, a lot of times that didn't matter. They still hit their target. The proximity fuse was one of our best weapons to combat this threat. But the 5-inch projectile was the smallest shell that this proximity fuse could be used with. The proximity fuse took advantage of a radio transmitter and receiver. So as this projectile is flying through the air, it's sending out a radio signal. And when that radio signal bounces back, telling the shell that it's maybe 70 feet away from a target, it explodes automatically. So this was very, very high-tech technology and top secret technology, in fact. So this 5-inch mount, all capital ships, fleet carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, they were equipped with this weapon. Now, the next line of defense after the 5-inch gun were the 40mm Bofors mounts. Now, this weapon fired a 2-pound high explosive projectile, had a rate of fire of 120 rounds per minute, and could hit targets at nearly 30,000 feet. I mean, this was a fantastic weapon against dive bombing attacks or torpedo plane attacks, but it just didn't have the oomph to, deflect these suicide attackers. So as I mentioned earlier, you blow off a wing, you blow off 2 wings. Once, it really doesn't matter. Once that aircraft is in that steep dive, it's an incoming cruise missile. And finally, the last line of defense was the 20mm Oerlikon mount. Now, this weapon fired a 4-ounce high explosive round, had a very high rate of fire, 450 rounds per minute, but only had a range of 3,000 feet. And this weapon was deemed completely inadequate against the kamikaze threat. So in spite of these sophisticated countermeasures, these suicide aircraft were still getting through and still causing major damage and major loss of life to U.S. Navy vessels and personnel. So in mid-July, the Allied intelligence was able to intercept a message that outlined this Japanese plan to convert their training squadrons into special attack units. Now, at first, this was some encouraging information because all the aircraft in these training squadrons were primary trainers, really. The Yokosuka K-5Y, which was codenamed Willow, by the Allies. Now, this aircraft would have been very similar to our primary trainer, the PT-17 Stearman. But these intercepts were outlining a plan that would see 4,300 of these aircraft converted to the suicide mission. So, yeah, the Japanese had 10,700 aircraft, but if nearly half of them were biplanes, they assumed that these were a minimal threat. That is until the night of July 28th and 29th, when 7 of these Willow aircraft, excuse me, were able to sink the USS Callahan, which coincidentally was the last US ship sunk by kamikazes during the war. They also heavily damaged the USS Case and Young and damaged the USS Pritchett. So that was 3 Fletcher-class destroyers at the cost of only 7 of these aircraft. And after action reports from the incident say they just came out of nowhere. They were right on top of us before we even knew what was going on. So these wooden fabric aircraft had this unintended advantage. The wooden fabric construction absorbed radar waves and it absorbed radio waves. So this piece of low tech actually rendered, the most advanced technology we had at the time pretty ineffective. So they were virtually invisible to radar. And then they just were unable, in many cases, to set off those proximity fuses to destroy them. So the Japanese plan was to send these out at night where they would have to be visually detected by a lookout. So, if it's any indication, what happened on July 28th and 29th with those 3 Fletcher-class destroyers, of the effectiveness of this aircraft. This Operation Olympic may have been a very, very, very costly operation. Another thing working in the Japanese favor for Olympic would have been this shift in tactics, where initially Japanese suicide tactics targeted aircraft carriers. Now, in order to inflict maximum casualties, these suicide pilots were being trained to identify transport ships. So just to give you an idea of how many service members may have been affected by this, a Haskell-class attack transport was designed to carry about 1,500 troops. So if these Japanese kamikazes had made significant hits on these transports, you would have seen a great loss of life. So if we were to assume the Japanese were as successful at Kyushu as they were at Okinawa, let's take that number of suicide aircraft they had available. And let's assume that 25% would have been destroyed on the ground. And let's assume another 25% would have been destroyed by the Combat Air Patrol. So this is with only half of that number reaching the target area. So once suicide aircraft reached the target area, based on experience at Okinawa, 18% of these suicide aircraft scored a hit, with 2% of them sinking a vessel. So at Kyushu, you're looking at 482 hits with 54 vessels sunk. Now, that may have occurred in as short a time span as 6 days. It would have been a saturation of these suicide aircraft. Now, if you look down below that, there's the previous wartime total. So these aerial suicide attacks had been taking place for the previous 6 months. So that's 368 hits with 34 vessels sunk over 6 months. And of course, that came with substantial loss of life. It's nearly 5,000 sailors killed in action, with another 5,000 wounded in action. Now, suicide aircraft weren't the only special attack units waiting for the U.S. invasion fleet at Kyushu. There were these suicide torpedoes called Kyushu. So there was 1,000 of these available. Now, how effective these would have been is probably negligible, but the fact of the matter remains that they were there and they were a threat. In addition to the suicide torpedoes, there were suicide motorboats. 800 of these defended Kyushu. Now, again, how effective might they have been? Anyone's guess. But I think by far the aerial suicide attack was by far the Japanese most successful tactic of the war. There's a photograph of one of those suicide boats. And the Japanese also had a water's edge attack force made up of suicide frogmen. So these guys would wait in the shallows with a mine, and they would destroy American landing craft as they approached the beach. Again, it's anyone's guess as to how effective these types of units may have been. Also, something else to remember is this island is conventionally defended as well. So there's lots of mines. It would have been a very, very, very difficult operation to undertake. So what would have troops experienced once they got ashore? Well, it would have been a ferocious battle at the water's edge. There was another shift in the Japanese defensive strategy at Kyushu. They planned to revert back to their ring defense that they had used in earlier campaigns, like at Tarawa or Saipan. So a very, a very hard outer ring defense. But once that ring is pierced and cut up in the pockets and reduced, that the American tanks might have seen tactics such as this with these lunge charges, which were mines placed on the end of bamboo poles, and Japanese soldiers just smashing them against the tanks to detonate them. Now, of course, that would have killed the attacker, but there were no shortage of imperial soldiers willing to die for the emperor, that's for sure. Now, this tactic worked relatively well on Okinawa. I believe the Americans lost about 220 tanks on Okinawa due to this tactic. And this was all to supplement their lack of anti-tank guns. Now, beyond that defensive ring, I think the Japanese had a couple of divisions that they were referring to as decisive battle divisions that they planned to truck or motor transport to the invasion area once it was established. But these divisions would have had great difficulty moving under U.S. air attack. So as U.S. forces moved inland, this is what they would have faced, the Japanese civilian defense effort. Now, there were over 1 million of these civilians ready to repel the invasion. Of course, they weren't equipped very well. You can see them here drilling with sharpened bamboo poles. But again, a threat that the U.S. forces would have definitely had to deal with. So to sum all that up, if we can make a casualty estimate at Kyushu based on the U.S. kill to loss ratio at Okinawa. And it's relatively easy to do just by multiplying by 10. So on Okinawa, there were a garrison of 76,000 Japanese troops. Now, it took the deaths of 12,520 U.S. servicemen to rid Okinawa of that garrison. with another 38,000 service members wounded. So we multiply that by 10, 760,000 Japanese troops on Kyushu, right? So to destroy just the military garrison there would have cost 125,200 American lives, with an additional 380,000 wounded in action. Now, I think these numbers are very conservative, by the way. So you're looking at a total number of U.S. casualties just for the first stage of Operation Downfall, numbering at 500,000. If you add the Japanese deaths in there, you're looking at 885,000. Just of their military personnel. So I think the most telling, fact of the matter is, or rumor of that time period, was that the U.S. government had put in an order of half a million Purple Hearts in anticipation for this invasion of Japan. So supposedly that supply of Purple Hearts has yet to be exhausted. And a soldier wounded in Afghanistan today may be a Purple Heart that was manufactured in World War II in anticipation for the invasion of Japan. So we compare that to what actually happened. So with the two atomic bomb detonations at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that's the total number of Japanese lives lost, 226,000, compared to that much larger number we saw just a second ago. Now, this gentleman is watching us today. His name's Arthur Grabiner, and he sent in a question earlier. Now, Arthur was very much invested in this, the end of the war, I should say. So Arthur was a World War II veteran who served aboard, Navy veteran who served aboard the USS Lawrence, which was an attack transport in the Pacific Theater. Now, he participated in the Battle of Okinawa, and he saw the Japanese aerial suicide attacks firsthand. And he was training up for the invasion of Japan when the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So Arthur has this question: war crimes committed by the Japanese against American POWs and the Chinese included massacre, human experimentation, starvation, forced labor. Japanese propaganda resulted in the horrifying suicide of Japanese civilians on Saipan. The debate over the morality of the dropping of the atomic bombs persists 75 years later. Given the well-documented brutality and savagery of the Japanese, I believe that the following fundamental question too often is unasked. What viable alternative did President Truman have other than to order the dropping of the atomic bombs over Japan? Well, hopefully the presentation you just saw, it's kind of a no-brainer. This invasion would have been very costly, very costly. Even if plans for the invasion were scrapped and they decided to conduct an aerial campaign against the Japanese islands that targeted their transportation system, you would have starved millions of Japanese because food wouldn't have been available. Also, you would have endangered the lives of thousands of American air crews. And if you were shot down over the Japanese main islands, your chances of survival were very, very slim. The Japanese were very cruel to our POWs and air crews who were shot down over the home islands. Now, Now we're going to take a few questions here. Excuse me. Okay. A lot of questions here. What would the effect of Field Marshal Count Hisashi Churchin's kill all order for Allied POWs had on Operation Downfall? I mean, I think that goes without saying. The Japanese would have eliminated all of our prisoners of war. But that was, I mean, I think the Japanese held 27,000 Americans, but 40% of them didn't survive the war anyway. Here's another question. Wouldn't some form of guerrilla warfare likely have gone on for several years if Japan had to be invaded? Well, if their conduct from earlier in the war is any indication of that, it could have gone on indefinitely. To the point where, I mean, the whole Japanese race may have had to be exterminated. I mean, you have Japanese holdouts. I think one was on the Philippines till 1973, I want to say, or maybe even after that, 77. I think one was on Guam till 1973. I mean, their fanaticism to die for the cause was unquestionable. So there's just no telling. All right, here's another question here. Did the U.S. Navy use Quad 50s as an anti-aircraft measure, or pretty much only the 20 and 40 millimeters? I wonder if the 50 calibers using tracer rounds might have helped against the Willows. I mean, that's possible. It may have been more useful for that, but I mean, the 20 millimeters and 40 millimeters were the only mounts on Navy vessels. They had gotten rid of the 50 calibers early on in the war. 50 calibers were used on water-cooled 50s were used aboard U.S. naval vessels up until like 42 or so. Okay, here's another question. In August 1945, my father was crossing the Pacific with the 511th PIR, 11th Airborne Division, en route to the invasion of Japan. Instead, they became an occupation force. Where would they have been staged August to October prior to actual invasion? There's definitely an answer to that, but I just don't know. I know the 11th Airborne was part of the floating reserve, and they weren't scheduled to make a landing on X Day. But I think they may have been in either Okinawa or the Philippines, I would reckon. But I'm sure there's an answer to that. I just don't know it. Okay, here's another question. Why was our intelligence so off and our deception operations so seemingly inept? Did anyone really think of an invasion of Korea would happen over invasion of Japan? Was it hubris, projection? Thanks. I think the hand had pretty much been played out. There was nothing left to invade. I think the only effective thing that Pastel was able to deceive the Japanese into preparing for was a large airborne invasion. So the Japanese were preparing for a large airborne force to be a part of that invasion, similar to Operation Overlord. But I guess everybody knew how it was going to end. By that time, it wasn't a question of will the Americans win the war? It's just when and how much would it cost? Here's another good question here. what is your perspective on the role of the Soviets' advances towards northern Japan and the Japanese decision to surrender? Well, I think that, invading Manchuria and, attacking, a Japanese protectorate and attacking the Japanese home islands are two very different things. I don't think the Soviet Navy's amphibious capability was up to the challenge of invading Japan, not at all. I think the Soviet advance was definitely just running through Manchuria, no doubt. But their ability to stage an amphibious operation to attack the Japanese home islands directly, I don't think that would have worked out very good for them. I guess we're out of time here, but that was a lot of great questions, and I'm really glad that everybody tuned in, and I hope you learned a little something. Again, these are just hypotheses. Nobody knows what would have happened for sure, but we can only imagine, and it's not very pretty. But thanks again for joining us, and I hope to see you next time.